If there's one thing I can say about the Steins fanbase, it's that it's marked by a series of bizarre contradictions. Steins is one of the most popular and best received anime and visual novels of all time. And yet despite that, much of its fanbase remains either unaware of or apathetic towards the vast majority of its content. I genuinely cannot think of any other series out there wherein most of its fanbase only ever goes through the second part of the story. Not the first, as you might expect, but the second. And having been a fan of Steins for a decade, and SciADV at large for a good 7 years, I've always wondered about how things ended up like this. Because this situation doesn't simply just affect some random Steins trivia knowledge, but rather an understanding of what Steins even is. Steins is so popular, and yet remarkably few of its fans are aware of the hundreds upon hundreds of hours worth of content it has. It's so popular, and yet remarkably few are aware that it's only the second part of a longer storyline. It's so popular, and yet remarkably few have a clear picture of the series' actual structure, vis-a-vis the overall chronology, how Steins connects with SciADV, what qualifies as canon within the series, or even where Steins 0 fits in. Given all these contradictions, one question I've always asked myself is how did such a popular and well-received series amass a fanbase wherein the overwhelming majority of its fans know so little about it? Just how did this bizarre and contradictory state of affairs come to be? And in this video, I seek to address why this paradox surrounding Steins fandom exists. I firmly believe that the awareness part of this paradox can be explained by these 4 things primarily. First, the consequences of decisions made in the making of the anime adaptations. Second, poor marketing. Third, the official English localizations. And fourth, years' accumulation of perpetuated misinformation by means of word of mouth. Meanwhile, I think the apathy part of this paradox can be explained by a number of different factors that have impacted the perceived value of both Steins and SciADV at large. Just a point of clarification though, the purpose of this video is not to belittle members of the Steins fandom or fans of the series who may not have been in the know about a lot of it. If you didn't know the amount of content that Steins had, or that Steins was the second part of a longer storyline, that's not your fault. I was once in those shoes. The reality is that it's Mage's fault, not yours, and I want to chronicle that in this video. But with that out the way, let's start off by discussing the franchise's anime adaptations, the first major contributor to this paradox. From the get-go, SciADV was off to a very rough start in anime form, vis-a-vis Madhouse's Chaos Head anime in 2008. At the time, 5PB was a brand new company, and Chaos Head was one of their first major releases. And to promote the release of the visual novel, they had planned a Chaos Head anime to release within mere months of it, meaning that the anime was in the works alongside the visual novel. However, 5PB and Nitroplus had opted to let Madhouse's staff handle the story internally with little input on the product itself. Considering the staff working on the project, that may not have seemed like such a bad idea. Planning the project was the legendary Masao Maruyama, directing the anime was veteran animator Takaki Ishiyama, and helming the scripts was Toshiki Inoue, renowned for his work on the anime adaptations for Tsugumi Oba and Takashi Obata's Death Note, Naoki Urasawa's Yawara, as well as Rumiko Takahashi's Ranma Half. But with the original staff largely uninvolved, the Chaos Head anime took way too many liberties from the source material, to a point that it was hardly recognizable, and to a point that it didn't cover much of the material that formed the basis for the rest of the overarching series narrative. Toshiki Inoue, the Chaos Head anime scriptwriter, was infamous for taking liberties from the source material in his scripts. And on top of this, the anime had to compress the considerably lengthy Chaos Head visual novel into just 12 episodes. To little surprise, it was not well received, neither by fans of the visual novel, nor by newcomers. But nonetheless, it did help a fair bit in terms of the IP's publicity. In just 2 months after the anime finished airing, 5PB, Nitroplus, and Red Flagship released an expanded director's cut-esque re-release of the Chaos Head visual novel called Chaos Head Noah. Like the original Chaos Head visual novel, it sold pretty well, 18,000 copies in its launch week. And later that year, they would follow up on Chaoshead's success with the SciADV franchise's second mainline entry, Steins Gate, which, like its predecessor, was also a great commercial success initially, selling 16,000 copies at launch. Given Steins Gate's reception and popularity, 5PB would then go on to announce a Steins Gate anime, which would air in spring of 2011. Fortunately, this time around, series staff had learned from their mistakes with the making of the Chaos Head anime, opting to be more involved in the Adaptations creative process. On top of that, they managed to secure the investment required for a 2-core adaptation of the story. Lo and behold, with a suitable episode count and strong direction, the Steins Gate anime became a roaring sensation, catapulting the IP to new heights with a massive number of subsequent multimedia developments. But this anime adaptation-derived popularity for Steins Gate was a massive double-edged sword for the Steins Gate and SciADV IP overall. Despite being handled well for the most part, the anime and franchise staff had made a number of peculiar adaptation decisions. The consequences of these decisions were in part a contributor to the Steins Gate anime's popularity, but they came at the steep cost of the rest of the Steins Gate IP, and far more so, the wider SciADV franchise. In an attempt to make the story more palatable to newcomers, the anime had cut almost all of Steins Gate's ties to Chaos Head and the wider series, leaving in just a Neidhart name drop and a brief callback to one of the big twists from one of the Chaos Head Noah character roots. Though much of it could technically be enjoyed on its own, the Steins Gate visual novel was not a completely standalone story, but rather the second part of the overarching SciADV storyline. And the context of Chaos Head Noah was a massive game changer for one's understanding and enjoyment of both Steins Gate and the rest of the series storyline. Without it, one would miss critical elements of the series' premise and its central themes. But as part of the anime's many cuts, it removed foreshadowing for plot points in future installments like robotics notes and anonymous code, mechanics-related explanations that tied into Chaos Head and the wider series narrative, an entire character with relevance to wider series lore, and all references to the Committee of 300, the SciADV franchise's central antagonistic force. The end result of all these cuts and changes was a version of Steins Gate that made it far from obvious that it was supposed to be the second part of a longer series. More than this, it deceived fans into believing that SciADV entries were simply just separate standalone stories that just happened to take place in the same universe, when this was, of course, the furthest thing from true. Ultimately, the sheer number of cuts in the Steins Gate anime made it very hard to parse and understand how it related to the rest of the storyline. And that is in essence where the Steins Gate anime is in part to blame for the paradox of Steins Gate's fanbase. The Steins Gate anime was largely well done, and it became very popular for a reason. But because it was handled in a way that detached it from the rest of the series, it became popular at the expense of SciADV. Compound this with the fact that anime is a much more popular medium than visual novels, and it's no surprise that this far more standalone version of Steins Gate's story drowned out the truth. Most fans suspect that one of the main reasons they approached Steins Gate's anime the way they did was because of how poorly received Chaos Head's anime was. The line of reasoning would follow that they detached Steins Gate's anime from Chaos Head's primarily for reputational reasons. But in the first place, even with those considerations aside, the Chaos Head anime didn't cover a lot of the critical content necessary for understanding later entries in the series, as well as the general overarching series narrative. So even if they did adapt Steins Gate's anime with wider series connections intact, it's not like most anime-onlys would have understood that content anyways. So given the circumstances, it was very much understandable that they would have wanted to make the anime more palatable towards newcomers. However, this was a strategy that they continued even with future entries as anime adaptations. A little more than a year after the end of the Steins Gate anime, the Robotics Notes anime started airing. And unlike the Steins Gate anime, which aired a year and a half after the release of its visual novel, the Robotics Notes anime aired little more than 3 months after its game. so it was in production concurrently with the visual novel and likely based off of an unfinished version of the scenario. This made it so that, much like its predecessor anime adaptations, Robotics Notes' anime also had a fair number of deviations from the source material, especially so in its latter half. And like the Chaos Head and Steins Gate anime adaptations, the Robotics Notes anime cut many of the story's ties to the wider series, in spite of the Robotics Notes visual novel effectively being like a Chaos Head Steins Gate crossover in a number of different ways. This had two distinct effects. First, because Mages had promoted Robotics Notes as a follow-up to Steins Gate, it ended up disappointing those with the wrong expectations for what it would be. With Robotics Notes' anime having fewer ties to Steins Gate and Chaos Head than the visual novel, this problem was compounded even further from how it was with the visual novel. Second, as a result of all these cuts and changes, the anime plotline became much more confusing to follow than the visual novels, and this sense of confusion was heightened given the fact that Robotics Notes' anime was locked in at just 22 episodes because of the production committee's agreement to air the series on Noitamina, a TV programming block that traditionally aired shows in 11-episode cours. This made it so that the anime was extremely pressed for time, especially given the fact that its source material was considerably longer than Steins Gate's. Ultimately, the anime ended up cramming phases 6, 8, 10, and 11 in just one episode each. Had they agreed to air the anime on a different network and had a slightly higher episode count, the Robotics Notes anime, in my opinion, could have been significantly improved if they had used their episodes a little bit more wisely. So in the end, as a result of these poor business and creative decisions, the Robotics Notes anime had significantly more mixed reception than the Steins Gate anime. Praises went to its animation, direction, and music, but heavy criticism was drawn towards its portrayal of the narrative and characters. This was definitely a shame, since Robotics Notes should have been very straightforward to adapt given its linear storyline. But alas, Robotics Notes remained in the shadow of its older cousin Steins Gate, in large part because of the disparity in the overall quality of their anime adaptations. And with the Robotics Notes anime having removed more of the story's connections to prior titles, this false image of them being separate standalone stories that just happened to be in the same universe only further proliferated. Past Robotics Notes and into Occultic 9 and Chaos Child, these audience misconceptions of the rest of SciADV only became worse. While the Occultic 9 anime was very well animated and well directed, it is what Chiyomaru has described as having fit 1.5 courses worth of content in the span of 12 episodes, largely through rapid-fast dialogue. Personally, this is one of my favorite parts of the Occultic 9 anime, but unfortunately this ended up alienating a lot more people than it attracted. And in addition, Occultic 9's placement within the series was very nebulous at the time, having originally been planned to be separate from SciADV, only to later be retconned and reincorporated into the series. And with that, Occultic 9 had 4 completely different versions of its story in 4 separate mediums, with all of them being important to piecing together the narrative's mystery. It was only natural that people ended up being very confused with how everything fit together. And in the end, many ended up dismissing Occultic 9 as an insignificant and inferior cousin of Steins Gate. Meanwhile, Chaos Child's anime ended up being just as bad of an adaptation as Chaos Head's, once again compressing the story in the span of 1 cour. But unlike the Chaos Head anime, Chaos Child's anime was actually supposed to be 2 cour originally. But at the last minute, one of their biggest investors backed out, forcing them to restructure the entire series and cut their episode count in half. With only 1 cour left to adapt the series' longest entry, there was little that the anime staff was able to do to deliver the story justice. While the Chaos Child anime did maintain ties to Chaos Head, having also recapped and readapted it within episode 0, the time constraints made it unable to convey all of the visual novel's significant cross-series ties, further contributing to misconceptions surrounding how the series was interconnected. The final nail in the coffin was the Steins Gate Zero anime in 2018, the only SciADV side entry to ever receive an anime. Like the original Steins Gate anime, the Zero anime was 2 cours and very well received. However, its success in length only exacerbated the illusion of Steins Gate being its own series. So all in all, one major element of this paradox was the series' anime adaptations, especially the decision-making that went into them. By virtue of them being much more standalone and having cut ties to the wider series narrative, anime-onlys failed to grasp how the entries in the series were connected with one another. And moreover, with the non-Steins Gate SciADV anime mostly being poor adaptations, people started completely dismissing the existence of the other entries entirely. Some factors of how the adaptations turned out, like with Chaos Child, were more so a result of business circumstances as opposed to decision-making, but nonetheless, the anime adaptations are in no small part responsible for this paradox. That being said, the anime adaptations were only part of the story. Another major contributor to this paradox went hand in hand with their adaptation decisions, marketing missteps on both the Japanese and English side. Nowadays, Magus' marketing for Steins Gate has its placement in SciADV more in the background. On the game's digital storefronts and on its website, they do refer to it as Speculative Science ADV Steins Gate and as the second entry in the Science Adventure series. However, by and large, they tend to market Steins Gate as its own series, despite the fact that it's just a small part of something much longer. And with the Steins Gate anime, they didn't even have Speculative Science ADV's subtitle as part of its copyright information or advertising. It was just titled and marketed as Steins Gate, devoid of any mention of SciADV. And because of the Steins Gate anime success, Magus ended up hyper-focusing on developing the Steins Gate IP specifically, targeting a market segment of Steins Gate onlys. It got to a point that there was a ridiculously disproportionate amount of Steins Gate material relative to non-Steins Gate SciADV material. And with all this additional Steins Gate material came a whole lot of Steins Gate specific marketing, which further served to drown out SciADV at large. How did marketing go with other SciADV entries in the meantime? As I briefly alluded to back when I was discussing the Robotics Notes anime, post Steins Gate, Magus had framed their marketing of SciADV entries more from the standpoint of being in the same series and universe as Steins Gate, since that's the entry that people know. Oftentimes, on top of plastering Steins Gate all over their marketing, they would deliberately incorporate copious amounts of Steins Gate related story elements to try and appeal to the Steins Gate only audience. They even went so far as to outright conceive entire games to get Steins Gate fans into the rest of the series, like Robotics Notes Dash, where they very unfortunately make Daru from Steins Gate the protagonist. On top of the series' marketing having shown the rest of the series in the shadow of Steins Gate, it also framed SciADV entries as games that anybody can play regardless of their prior familiarity with the series, even though that's not exactly true from a standpoint of narrative and thematic understanding. And such a way of framing SciADV only further reinforced misunderstandings about the series' interconnectedness. A lot are under the impression that SciADV entries are just separate standalone stories that just happen to take place in the same world. But the reality is that SciADV entries are connected very similarly to how JoJo parts are, albeit a little bit more forgiving in viewing order. Each part has its own unique cast, setting, and semi-self-contained plot, but ultimately serves to construct a larger overarching narrative. Each entry builds upon its predecessor's concepts, mechanics, and plot points, often featuring returning characters and the same central antagonist. With that, there's also a significant amount of foreshadowing for future installments in each entry, and the further and further the series developed, the more reliant each subsequent entry became upon the context of prior games. By the time you get to Anonymous Code, a game whose biggest value is what it means for the series narratively and thematically, you would be missing out on everything that makes the game special if you were to forego the entire series preceding it. Yet even for Anonymous Code, they positioned it as a game that you could go through as its own entry point. This is part of why they originally classified Anonymous Code as part of the Science Visual Novel series, a brand they marketed as distinct from SciADV. Not because they outright intended on Anonymous Code being a non-SciADV title, but because they wanted to signal to newcomers that it was okay to go through without prior series knowledge. The Science Visual Novel branding was quickly abandoned, and the final version of Anonymous Code was the grand culmination of SciADV, not something separate from it. But its original branding and marketing has led to confusion that has lasted to this day. I still come across people who are confused by where Occultic 9 and Anonymous Code fit in within the series because of this old science visual novel branding, and mages truly only have themselves to blame for that. Evidently, the series' Japanese marketing is at odds with its actual design, and unfortunately, the same is also true for the English side too. Honestly, even worse than how it is on the Japanese side. Because of licensing and porting issues, SciADV entries were released in English entirely out of order. Even if they wanted to release them in order, they straight up couldn't. In the end, first up was Steins Gate. Then came Steins Gate 0 and Chaos Child. A few years later came the two Robotics Notes games, and only after all that, in late 2022, came the first and most important entry in the series, Chaos at Noah. Because they had to localize the games out of order, the English publishers further doubled down on marketing them as standalone games, underselling the overarching series narrative and the series' interconnectedness. For instance, on the English version of Steins Gate's Steam page, its description doesn't actively say anything about its ties to SciADV, so it's no wonder that English-speaking Steins Gate players will often end up having no idea at all that it is not a completely standalone story. And on Chaos Child's Steam page, since it was the first non-Steins Gate SciADV game to be localized, it was marketed as a standalone story with ties to the Steins Gate universe, as opposed to SciADV entry number 4, like they did in Japan. And unlike the Japanese page, they don't even mention that it's a thematic sequel to Chaos at Noah. It wasn't until after Chaos at Noah was licensed for an English release that Spike Chunsoft started marketing Chaos Child as the sequel to Chaos at Noah. Before then, the English publishers would try to undersell its connections as much as they possibly could. Those of you who have played through SciADV would know that Chaos Child is effectively a sequel to Chaos at Noah in every way besides the cast. It is incredibly reliant upon its audience having experienced the prequel beforehand, not simply just in terms of narrative, but especially so in its portrayal of its themes. But nonetheless, back in the day, both P-Cube and Spike Chunsoft would undersell the Chaos duology's interconnectedness, heavily contributing to fandom-wide misconceptions. Of course, the reason that both the Japanese and English sides would try to market their games as standalone and appropriate entry points was because they wanted to encourage people to buy their games. If you advertise your games as requiring another obscure title to be played first, you'll inevitably get far fewer sales. And in the medium of visual novels, which is already incredibly niche, that was something they could not afford to do. When running a business, the most important thing is profit. So they wanted to eliminate barriers to entry with the series. But because SciADV from an artistic standpoint was designed in a way where you still needed a few prerequisites for most entries anyhow, it only resulted in perpetuated confusion. In short, a big part of this paradox's existence is the series' marketing being at odds with its actual design. It portrays SciADV as separate standalone stories in the same universe, rather than as parts of a larger overarching series narrative like they actually are. And additionally, the heavy emphasis on Steins Gate specifically has come at the cost of awareness of what SciADV itself is. People began to perceive SciADV entries as Steins Gate spin-offs, or very marginally related stories that just happen to be in Steins Gate's universe, rather than as Steins Gate being the second part of the SciADV storyline. On a somewhat related note, another big contributor to this paradox is the inconsistent nature of the official English localizations, which further erased some of the series' interconnectedness. I mentioned earlier how the games were all localized out of order, which was a major part of this paradox, especially given that Steins Gate was the first one to come to the West officially. But on top of that, the English localizations for the games were localized with varying levels of quality and by different parties with very different levels of familiarity with SciADV's narrative. As such, a significant number of references, callbacks, and pieces of foreshadowing ended up being mistranslated in the actual game's official releases due to translators' lack of context. This was especially problematic in Chaos at Noah and the two Robotics Notes games. Chaos at Noah due to it being the first and most important entry in the franchise, and the Robotics Notes sub-series because before Anonymous Code, it was the most crossover-heavy part of SciADV. One of the most saddening parts about SciADV's official localizations is that the people working on them were often put under very dire time and budget constraints. For instance, the translator for Chaos Child and Steins Gate 0, Adam Lenzenmayer, was made to localize both games in less than 6 months each. he has publicly commented on how grueling his working conditions were, especially that of Chaos Child, considering just how long of a game it is, and the end result of his working conditions were unfortunately localizations that were fairly criticized for inaccuracies and flat prose compared to the Japanese. Meanwhile, the localizations afterwards for the other Steins Gate side games, as well as the 2 Robotics Notes games, were contracted to strangely compelling multimedia, and those localizations were also heavily criticized for their spottiness as well, especially when it came to cross-series connections. In the Committee of Zero's first version of their Robotics Notes improvement patch, they ended up changing an entire third of the game's script. And in the case of Chaos at Noah, its official localization was easily the worst received in franchise history. Its official release was criticized harshly for censorship, cut content, game-breaking bugs, reading poorly, and featuring a plethora of mistranslations, especially when it came to content relevant for the rest of the franchise. After all, Chaos at Noah is the entry that sets up the rest of the series, and its official English release nuked much of its critical foreshadowing. So those who, unfortunately, had no choice but to play the game unpatched on Switch ended up missing a fair bit of that vital setup for future material. The fact that Noah's official translators ended up going uncredited is likely testimony to simply not being proud of how their work turned out, though I imagine that time constraints and working conditions played a significant role. But ultimately, SciADV's localizations just ended up being inconsistent. The lack of consistency with series-wide terminology made it so that many cross-series connections ended up being lost in-game, and that further reinforced misunderstandings surrounding how the series was interconnected. Those of you who have seen my anonymous code implications video would note that this series is extremely careful in its terminology, and game after game, they used a very specific set of key terms to refer to the same exact concepts with relevance to the wider series mysteries and future events. But with the games being translated out of order and by different people, a lot of these important key terms were translated incorrectly or inconsistently in the official localizations. So inevitably, a significant amount of foreshadowing was altered or lost, to the point that people end up getting to anonymous code, having somehow missed an essential aspect of SciADV's premise and the single biggest elephant in the room throughout SciADV's run. Admittedly, some of these mistranslations present in the games, like in the original Steins Gate, were due to a lack of future series context at the time, but others were pretty indefensible, like mistranslating the name of a returning character. For PC players, admittedly, because the Committee of Zero's patches exist, this issue isn't as much of a concern there, but at the very least, for console players who don't have the improvement patches as an option, this is a major contributor to misunderstandings surrounding cross-series connections. And that somewhat leads into my next reason as to why I believe this paradox exists: perpetuated misunderstandings and misinformation by word of mouth. In essence, it is the snowball effect. Misinformation inevitably breeds more misinformation, and that is made so much worse when that misinformation was part and parcel of the soil and roots of the Western SciADV fandom. For a long time, people mainly went off of hearsay and the anime adaptations to discuss how the series was interconnected. And since it was only a few years ago that most of the series was localized in the West, a huge number of the popular posts and reviews concerning the series were made before people had a lot of very important context. Thus, the content out there from before that point portrays a very flawed understanding of what SciADV actually is and how Steins Gate fits in with all that. Oftentimes, those older posts and pieces of content will be first up in search results, and when people search up how Steins Gate is connected with these other titles with semicolons in them, they end up clicking on posts and videos made before people had adequate context to truly understand what SciADV actually was. Even within the context of the Steins Gate subseries specifically, you see oftentimes with a lot of watch order videos out there, they falsely denote that the Steins Gate movie is non-canon. Though as we know nowadays, with the context of the rest of SciADV, as well as the movie's novelization and supplementary material, that isn't true at all. But since this understanding of the movie's fit within the SciADV canon was formed and popularized before most of the series was translated, it has unfortunately stuck with people to this day, and that misinformation has only spread more and more. So ultimately, the snowball effect has also played a tremendous part in the lack of awareness that people have on SciADV and how the series is interconnected. Now, all of these factors more or less address the lack of awareness that characterizes much of the fandom. But what about those who are aware of the true nature of the series, but are wholly apathetic to it? After all, there's still a good number of people out there who are aware that Steins Gate has hundreds upon hundreds of hours worth of content, yet they only care specifically about the Steins Gate anime or about the Steins Gate games. Similarly, some out there are aware that SciADV exists, but simply are not interested in anything more than just the Steins Gate subseries. Why is that? There's a couple of reasons. First is simply just a lack of interest in certain mediums. SciADV is a multimedia franchise told in multiple different mediums, but the average person out there is probably not that interested in all forms of media. Some naturally only care about anime, some only care about visual novels, some only care about manga or light novels. But when you have a series that makes you have to go through so many of these mediums, people inevitably just stick with a small subsection of it that they actually value. And for those who are only interested in anime in the first place, this series hasn't really left you with many options for a strong adaptation to begin with. Your options are pretty much just the Steins Gate anime and then several poor rushed adaptations. Related to the lack of interest in certain mediums is the lack of interest in certain sci-fi topics. While every SciADV entry is somewhat dependent on the delusional science mechanics established in Chaos Head, someone who's only seen the Steins Gate anime might not realize that. And as it stands, almost every SciADV subseries has its own unique sci-fi concept that it tackles, be it robots, the occult, or hacking. And not everyone is interested in all these sci-fi topics. This is part of why part skipping is as prevalent as it is in the fandom. A lot of people out there consume the series without care or regard to the overarching narrative, but solely out of interest in particular sci-fi concepts like time travel. Without actually going through the rest of the series for themselves, do Steins Gate onlys have any way of knowing that it might not be the only subseries with time travel in it? Not really. But this genre-related perception is a major part of the apathy that some have towards the rest of SciADV. Speaking of perceptions, another element of this problem has to do with how people look at Steins Gate relative to the rest of the series. Oftentimes, because the Steins Gate anime is so well received, and the other SciADV anime adaptations are very poorly received, the respective anime receptions carry over into how people perceive their respective visual novels. Logically, one would think that an adaptation being bad does not necessarily mean that a work's source material is bad. But in reality, people don't actually stick by this assumption. If the adaptation is bad, people have no reason to suspect that the source material is good. Usually, an anime adaptation is little more than an advertisement for an existing IP, but if the advertisement fails to convince people to check out the source, then that's that. In the case of SciADV, since only the Steins Gate subseries anime are well received, people often end up thinking that only Steins Gate is worth checking out at all. That is to say, the Steins Gate anime has created this illusion of Steins Gate being the only good SciADV entry because it was the only one with a strongly received anime adaptation. Its overwhelming popularity compared with the rest of the series only furthers this illusion. And as a result, so many people end up checking out Steins Gate compared to their other entries, creating a snowballing cycle where what's already popular and well received only becomes more popular and more well received. Now, on a separate note, another reason for this widespread sense of apathy is the deceptive appearance of the other titles. By design, SciADV is a franchise whose premise is based around exploring this blurred boundary between the real and fake and questioning the nature of the world. After all, as the series' defining line goes, is the scenery your eyes perceive truly real? Ultimately, the series in its design is one that embeds itself in these deceptive appearances. For instance, the Chaos series is designed in art style to look like a traditional galgame to create a sense of contrast between its romance game-like appearance and its actual gruesome and grotesque content, as well as to further this sense of dichotomy between perceptions and reality. One would think that, based on the series' premise, people wouldn't judge a book by its cover, but the reality is that people absolutely do. Not just those who aren't aware of the premise due to skipping Chaos at Noah, but also even those who have gone through more than one entry in the series. This is why Robotics Notes, despite being quite dark, especially in its second half, is often skipped or glossed over by people in favor of other titles. From its cover and synopsis, people envision it as just a happy-go-lucky slice of life or as little more than a mecha, and therefore uninteresting to them. And this is also why some skip over the Chaos games because they look like algae. It's a matter of perception. And lastly, and perhaps most significantly, it is the design of the narrative, the main story of Steins Gate. Steins Gate ends off on such a strong note, almost so well, that a lot of people don't ever end up wanting anything more to do with it, or anything remotely related to it despite adoring it. There is this sentiment of any further content ruining the ending or ruining the series, even if a good chunk of it predated the anime. And for this reason, some people end up deliberately avoiding Steins Gate side material and other SciADV entries. Even when it comes to Steins Gate's upcoming thematic sequel, a number of Steins Gate onlys display this sentiment of not wanting it to exist because they feel as though it might ruin the original Steins Gate's perfect ending. Even those Steins Gate onlys who are aware of SciADV's existence. And that is in essence why I believe the apathy side of the paradox exists. So when we look at it overall, why is it that, despite its popularity and reception, that Steins Gate amassed a fanbase that hardly knew or cared much for the vast majority of the series' content? On the ignorance front, I believe it was a matter of poor adaptation decisions, marketing missteps, circumstances surrounding the official localizations, and perpetuated misinformation within fandom discourse. And on the apathy side, I believe it can fundamentally be explained by differences in interest across different mediums and genres, perceptions in the appearances of other titles, as well as the narrative design of the original Steins Gate. You might be wondering what I think mages, the English publishers, and the other involved parties could have done differently to avoid this paradox from existing in the first place. After all, they all had businesses to run, and they needed to maximize their sales. The way they all saw it, with a niche series like SciADV, they needed to advertise everything as an appropriate entry point into the series, even when that wasn't true, because they needed to sell. And once Steins Gate became so overwhelmingly popular because of its anime, they had to leverage its name to get more people interested in the rest of SciADV. So what could they have done? I think there's a few things. First, I think that mages should not have named the franchise the Science Adventure series simply because it sounds more like a genre than it does an actual series. It denotes the concept of the franchise rather well. They're sci-fi ADV games that are connected very similarly to how the different parts of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure are, but it doomed itself from the start in terms of recognizability. Second, I think that mages should have been involved in the making of the original Chaos Head anime. Even within the span of a single cour, that anime could have been a much stronger adaptation, as is evident by how much stronger Chaos Child Episode 0 is, despite only being 20 minutes long. And had the Chaos Head anime retained more of the content necessary to set up the rest of the series, the future anime adaptations wouldn't have had as much of an incentive to cut their inter-series ties and make their stories more standalone. Third, I think from the very beginning, the series should have either gone deeper with the interconnectivity, or it should have ditched it entirely. If SciADV was more unambiguously and openly interconnected, people wouldn't be so confused. Or alternatively, if it was actually a series of legitimately standalone stories with no overarching narrative, then this wouldn't even be a paradox. Whatever the case may be, at the end of the day, the result of this paradox is a problem of brand recognition. Steins Gate itself is widely recognized, but the fact that it has as much content as it does, and the fact that it's just part 2 of a longer series, is not well known at all. My hope is that, little by little, this changes. Please let me know your thoughts on this paradox. Are there any other reasons for its existence that you can think of that I didn't mention? Just how did this peculiar set of circumstances come to be? But before I end this video, I have a little more to say, more informally. I originally had this entire project end right before this point, but recently, I had a series of interactions that made me want to add in a final section to the video, because I think there's something I need to make abundantly clear. I've come across a few people who've been spreading this take that the reason that people don't go through the rest of SciADV is because Steins Gate is amazing, but the rest of the series sucks. And of course, those I've seen spread this opinion haven't actually gone through much of SciADV for themselves. They look at the anime adaptations' mal scores and call it a day. So to be direct, I vehemently reject this take. From an apathy perspective, Steins Gate fans don't avoid other entries in the series because they're bad. They have no way of definitively knowing whether or not they're bad without playing through those stories for themselves. And if you ask people who have gone through this series, the overwhelming majority will tell you that it's an amazing franchise with so many great stories. The biggest reason Steins Gate fans avoid the rest of the series is because they perceive them as not worth going through due to the reasons I had mentioned earlier in the video. Like a significant amount of SciADV's audience, I like most of the other entries more than Steins Gate. And this is a very common sentiment for people to have after this classic series of events. Someone goes through Steins Gate, loves it, finds out it's part of a longer series, goes through the rest of the series, and ends up liking a lot of it more than Steins Gate. There's also people out there who end up going through all of SciADV and still love Steins Gate the most, which is totally fair and a valid opinion to have. But the beauty of this series is that there's something in it for everyone, and all of these stories in this series are truly incredible. The fact that you constantly find people with radically different rankings is a testament to this. I like Anonymous Code and the Chaos games the most because of their thematic richness, social commentary, and narrative strength. You'll find others who love Robotics Notes and Steins Gate the most because they value slice of life and character interactions. To each their own. Yet despite this diversity in opinions throughout the SciADV fandom, you still constantly come across people crying out to the world, "Steins Gate is a masterpiece, I wish I could go through it for the first time all over again." But then when you're like, "Hey, I'm glad you enjoyed Steins Gate, would you be interested in the other 99% of the story that you can still go through for the first time?" And then they're like, "No, why would I do that?" And honestly, fair enough, the series is long, not everyone's interested in more than just anime, and you shouldn't go through what you're not interested in. But as a fan of this series, when this ends up being the overwhelming majority of people that go through Steins Gate, I can't help but feel a little saddened by how much people are missing out on, continuously looking forward to going through the same tiny percentage of the series over and over and over again. Recently, I've also come across some even more bizarre takes. On r/SteinsGate, a few people have commented that they hate the fact that people use the SciADV subreddit for more than just Steins Gate. They argue that the premise of Chaos Head and SciADV somehow ruins Steins Gate for them, and they refuse to get into SciADV because the other entries are supposedly boring and unrealistic, with worse stories and worse characters, despite never playing through the rest of the series for themselves. All the while, they've also paired these claims with completely wrong and parroted understandings about what SciADV even is, falsely spreading notions that this series is not very interconnected and that the connections it does have are forced and uninteresting. They've also personally told me that they hate that SciADV fans like myself say that other entries are better. To this, I apologize for having an opinion. But at the very least, I actually went through the series for myself, so it's at least an informed and legitimate opinion. I'm not going around making conclusions about stories I haven't touched. It's a common joke within the SciADV community to say, "Why are there magic swords in my Steins Gate universe?" to poke fun at the assumption that the Chaos series are Steins Gate spin-offs, when Chaos Head came first and Steins Gate science is based off of Chaos Heads. After all, it's so bizarre that some people find magic memory powers and sending data through black holes okay, yet draw some invisible line at delusions. But even though the sci-fi in the Chaos series is based on legitimate scientific concepts like direct sea theory, it's not what people are familiar with and comes across as very fantastical. That's why it doesn't appeal to some people as much as something very common and seemingly grounded as time travel, especially when that's the first thing they've been introduced to. Of course, so long as the rules within a series are internally consistent, I don't see why its realism matters that much. What matters most to me is the message of a story, and thankfully, that is something SciADV excels in. I wouldn't be who I am today if it weren't for the profound themes of a lot of the other entries, and it disappoints me that there's people out there who, in spite of never actually going through SciADV, spread so much misinformation about it. That, to me, is why the paradox of Steins Gate's fanbase matters. The rise of Steins Gate's popularity didn't just make a massive audience of Steins Gate onlys. It unfortunately created an entire set of fans with a fundamentally flawed default understanding of what the series is and should be. To be clear, I don't at all think that someone's better than someone else simply for going through a story that they haven't. And I also don't think it's inherently wrong to only be interested in a small part of the series. It's all just fiction at the end of the day. But nonetheless, this paradox is a fascinating phenomenon that's always been on my mind, and I wanted to comment on it. These recent interactions have also inspired an upcoming piece of mine, which I am tentatively titling The Prevalence of Part Skipping in SciADV, when fans miss the premise of a series. After all, how is it that people get 6 entries deep into the franchise, having entirely missed what the series was about? It might not just be a matter of media literacy, but rather also a result of missing critical information as a result of skipping some of the most essential parts of the series, be it due to accessibility or personal interest. Please look forward to this upcoming video's release. Special thanks to Fasty, and with that in mind, I'll see you later.